This program is brought to you by Grand Valley State University.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I thank you for inviting me. I have been thinking about some things over the last several months as I was talking to a couple of the fellows. And when I agreed to do this, I thought, well, the safe thing is to do something that I've done before, right? Recycle a little bit, maybe a pastiche, if you will. A lot of people do that. We've all been to these things before. But I thought I would try something that I hadn't. So what you're going to get today is the result of some ruminations of mine on what I think is a significant social issue in the United States today. And the pattern will be this. I thought for the first 2 hours I would talk, and then we would go into breakout session and come back for the last hour in here. So is that an acceptable schedule? Okay. All right. If I were asked to suggest a single word that's among the most frequently used in today's public and private discourse, the word would be communication. We've learned a great deal about our ability to communicate with one another through the academic study of techniques, purposes, and impact. We've also learned a great deal about how to use those techniques to achieve a desired purpose that goes beyond making ourselves understood by our audience. This is also communication. Anyone in a position of authority in any type of organization today is reminded nearly daily, if not more frequently, of the necessity of communicating, to keep people informed, to make sure we're all on the same page, or to be sure there are no surprises. In 1946, George Orwell wrote an essay expressing concern over the damage done to the English language by politicians, academics, and purveyors of jargon in general. He believed that language shaped thought. If we accept this, then we must realize that when thought is communicated in a particular language, it must be understood from a common perspective. This is, of course, perfected in Orwell's use of newspeak in 1984, but that was in a wholly negative manner. I'm suggesting that it's our common understanding of the language, how it might be used to communicate ideas, and also how it might be manipulated, that provide the platform for any sense of legitimacy of leadership. Please don't think I'm just analyzing an oratorical technique or platform manner. Rather, I'm concerned with the basic definitions of words themselves and how that common understanding of meaning might be manipulated or undermined to make political and therefore public discourse pointless. Our contemporary civic discourse is particularly non-productive. I think this is due to three factors. One is a postmodern mentality that redefines or even removes context. Second is the very successful public relations business, which has taken all the commercial success of consumer advertising, combined this with some basic psychological and sociological research, and permeated every aspect of modern life with a nuanced vocabulary and presentation techniques which purport to inform, but more accurately, frequently overwhelm. And third, and possibly as a result of the first two, we've entered an age in which belief is more important than fact. To the first point, I think we're at a critical point in how we view the development of knowledge. 2 or 3 generations from now, a student of intellectual history may very well describe the beginning of the 21st century as a watershed in Western thought, if not in global thought. It matters how we think truth is discovered or created, and you should be aware of the difference. I think we might imagine ourselves in, pardon this awkward construction, a postmodern period in which we face a bifurcation of thought and processes that suggest either a renewal of the Enlightenment on the one hand or an emphasis on deconstructive interpretation on the other. If these parallel lines persist, we will be as the proverbial ships in the night. However, in this case, we'll all claim to be looking in the same direction and not in opposite directions. explain it. The Enlightenment may be located in that remarkable 17th century with people such as William Harvey, Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, and René Descartes. They're examples of curious people trying to understand the world and themselves through observation, experimentation, and reason. This process was applied to the foundations of society by John Locke. This is the scientific method that you have all had contact with. It's a key element in the scientific, industrial, and political revolutions of modern times. The United States itself is a child of the Enlightenment. The philosophy of the nation is progress. That is a conviction that there's a discernible movement towards some identifiable point. There are other progressive interpretations of history, including Christian and Marxist, but the gift of the Enlightenment was the belief that by discovering natural laws, humankind could be shaped to conform to those laws. The result of this would be a perfectly functioning society, and this notion can be traced well into the 20th century. One of the leading historians of the New Deal, William Leuchtenberg, it's impossible for a New Deal specialist not to mention something about Franklin Roosevelt or the New Deal, so you'll forgive that, characterized the reformers who followed Roosevelt to Washington in these words. This is a quote: "Heirs of the Enlightenment, they felt themselves part of a broadly humanistic movement to make man's life on earth more tolerable, a movement that might someday even achieve a cooperative commonwealth." That's a 20th century examination of 18th century Enlightenment roots and a common understanding of what was holding the nation together. So that's the point that should not be lost from that. Think about the founding documents of the United States. The Declaration of Independence asserts that some considerable actions may become necessary in the course of human events. That action was to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. These are familiar words to you, I hope. Surely, and if they're not, please don't admit it. We hold these truths to be self-evident. You've all heard that. That among these other rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then, of course, there's the Constitution and its preamble. It says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." Those are commonly held beliefs. And lastly, look at the Great Seal of the United States. If you, in these economic times, if you actually have a dollar bill, look at the back of the dollar bill where the Great Seal of the United States is represented. The founders clearly believed that they were establishing not just a new nation, but a new order for the ages. Why was this even considered possible? Why did not someone say, well, that may be what you believe, but it doesn't apply to me? Or what do you mean by those words? Are they just symbols for your hidden agenda? For we know there is no such thing as universal truth. There may have been some who thought in those terms, but I'd suggest that most Americans who read those words accepted the basic underlying premise that it was their natural right to do that, and that right was discoverable through the use of reason. Gradually, John Locke's social enlightenment was combined with the more scientific expression to try to understand the natural world and to find ways to shape civil society to that world. This perspective informed all the reform movements of the next 200 years of American history. The West was so captivated by science and so sure that scientific research would continue to provide for the improvement of humankind that science became dominant in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Broadly speaking, this development is today characterized as modernism. Scientific evidence was the final answer to many age-old questions ranging from Darwin through Einstein, that is, evolution to nuclear power. It was even included with such people as Frederick W. Taylor and his principles of scientific management, and it was the basis of the progressive reform movement at the turn of the last century. By the 20th century, we had entered the age of the expert. To be an expert, you have to know a lot about something, and that something has to be universally accepted to have an expert in it, right? I mean, it's sort of a tautology, but it does work. Modernism infiltrated the arts and architecture. The basic components of human beings as represented in Cubism. Everybody likes to remember the nude descending a staircase. Not the perfect image of a human being, but one that is broken down in perception by that particular artist. The stripped away forms and language of poetry, as illustrated by E.E. Cummings and T.S. Eliot. And the Bauhaus movement in architecture, seeking the ultimate natural harmony of form and function. These were all reactions against the over-systematic certainties of the Victorian age. New psychological and psychiatric insights were employed to develop new understandings of the relationship of individuals to the physical, artistic, and literary worlds. Strong elements of modernism were still searching for a universal truth or system. This is not the case with postmodernism. Postmodernism was a reaction against the conviction that there was a universal ideal, and it was thus a reaction against the assumed certainty of scientific evidence as the ultimate explanation of reality. For postmodernists, reality is a mental construct rather than a physical reality waiting to be discovered. So truth is not so much discovered as it is created. It's validated by its relationship to the reality of one's own experience rather than an objective reality. This clearly has some validity, and it's not entirely new. One need only think for a moment about the Romantic movement of the 19th century and the work of early 20th century anthropologists to realize that not everything might have universal application to all people at all times. But scientists, as well as postmodernists, must recognize that there are alternative perspectives of the same problem. This should not be interpreted as saying that all perspectives are equally valid. An early advocate of deconstruction, in fact, was the American philosopher Charles S. Peirce. Many of you may have encountered him in a philosophy class. William James gave him the credit for the foundations of the theory of pragmatism. He recognized alternatives as conceptions or ideas which were putative truth, but ultimately verifiable. This is the important point that's been eliminated in our postmodern world of deconstruction. It's precisely this level of respect and the capacity for synthesis leading to verifiability, which I think is lacking in today's intellectual landscape. Now, as an illustration of this, I offer the debate over climate change. One of the most important scientific issues of the day is global climate change. We should be careful not to call it global warming, since anytime there's a particularly and unseasonably cold day in some part of the country, local newspapers receive letters from people who offer that day's temperature as proof against the theory of global warming. One can suggest here that it might be useful to understand the difference between climate and weather, but that would be a digression. Point is that if we can simply assert that we do not accept scientific theory, such as Darwinian evolution, or that a casually collected observation disproves climate change, then the future of what we have known as scientific facts is precarious indeed. We need to find a way to reconcile these antagonistic perspectives, or our ability to solve problems which require a synthesis of science and public policy will disappear. My great concern is that in our present circumstances, the social trend of picking and choosing what scientific theory we will believe, that it will determine our trust and confidence, will undermine, our trust and confidence in scientific solutions. I'm not arguing here that science must regain the position of invincibility which it enjoyed in the 19th century. It just seems clear to me that we can't expect much of an improvement in the human condition if scientific truth can be interpreted at will by any and every group imaginable. There is an anti-science mood in the country that only an educated population can overcome. Naturally enough, I would suggest that education is the solution to this divergence that results in not just multiple paths to truth, but multiple truths. When Jefferson wrote that we hold these truths to be self-evident, he expected people who read them to understand them in the same sense he did when he wrote them. He didn't suspect that they would be viewed as a unique text covering a variety of symbols and clues about their real meaning, but that they were signifiers, not necessarily pointing to the signified, that they reflected only the cultural forces of the time and could not be extended forward in time. I'm not suggesting that postmodern deconstruction techniques are to be dismissed, but rather that they also be seen in the proper context. I'll give you another illustration. Consider something called the simulacrum, a word that nobody uses anymore for good reason. I purposely, by the way, decided not to have a PowerPoint today when the call asked what kind of equipment I needed, because this is about how you think and how you receive language. And I didn't want you to read it. I didn't want you to watch it and sit down and see things and carry out if you're a visual list of something. I wanted it to go through your mind and have you really think about it and turn it over yourself. So that's the reason there's no PowerPoint. That's only partially true. I lied. I don't know how to do PowerPoints. But I have people who work with me who know, and they would have done it if I'd asked. Right? So the option was there, but was consciously rejected. Right? What is a simulacrum? Is a likeness or a similarity. In these technology-driven times, we have the capacity to reproduce images and sounds nearly instantly and in apparently limitless quantities. This poses questions of originality and creativity. Take the example of a CD. Subsequent copies of a CD are indistinguishable from the original, whereas at least most art experts claim subsequent copies of the Mona Lisa are very distinguishable from the original. Some modern deconstructionists, however, would argue that there is no difference between the original and the simulacrum, the likeness, and therefore, and this is the important part, all images and sounds are truth. This is seen as a way of breaking down the notion of the privileged position of some systems of thought. Context, and more to the point, word selection, leads us to the second characteristic of communication that I mentioned. I suggested that you browse the website of a man named Frank Luntz. I don't know how many of you did that. His company is Luntz Muslansky Strategic Research. To get an idea of how language can be shaped and designed by leaders, not necessarily to educate or even to persuade, but rather appeal to certain identifiable receptors in the audience. Now, I've had the opportunity to hear Mr. Luntz speak. He is an extraordinarily articulate and persuasive person. His book is one of the most aptly titled bestsellers in the past few years. The book is Words That Work. It's not what you say, it's what people hear. Think about that. I recommend the book to you, by the way. Mr. Luntz has skillfully used focus groups to identify responses from people to any number of public issues. By identifying words to which groups respond positively, he's able to advise his clients regarding the vocabulary, the presentation, and the tone of their communication. Now, I happened to hear Terry Gross interview him on her NPR program, Fresh Air. And this is a notable interview, I think, for him because of the candor and examples he used in this interview. You can see it referred to on a variety of websites, including the ubiquitous Wikipedia. I was fascinated because the interviewer in this case thought it might be interesting to get him into a conversation about George Orwell's view of language and whether he was doing something to undermine it. Luntz writes in his book of his admiration for Orwell and the identity of their goals, which is an interesting response. He very capably demonstrates how his approach is actually an extension and clarification of Orwell's thesis because his work was designed to provide the most precise vocabulary to facilitate the communication between the speaker and the listener. After his careful analysis of the impact of certain words on listeners, he would be able to identify the most efficient way to deliver the message to a receptive audience. Now, if you have read Orwell's essay and you have read this book, you'll know that that's a masterpiece of public relations statement because it's not exactly what he does, but it sounds wonderful. One of the illustrations he used was how his political clients would be able to position themselves as patriotic advocates of energy independence, not by diminishing our reliance on foreign oil, or even oil in particular, but by more adequately developing our already extensive domestic oil reserves. He conceded that calling for more, this is a timely topic as it turns out, calling for more oil drilling produced unpleasant connotations, especially regarding oil spills offshore. How many of us still have embedded in our memories pictures of various seabirds being washed so that they can then resume their lives, or not being able to survive these nasty oil spills? So his solution, it's not a policy solution, it's a communication solution, it's a vocabulary solution. It's, rather than call it oil drilling, his clients were advised to support energy exploration. Focus groups reacted much more favorably to the notion of exploration as opposed to drilling. The question here is this technique acceptable for a leader to use? Do leaders, as opposed to those who still aspire to become leaders, have any special responsibility to inform beyond the most acceptable vocabulary for that audience, which will then solidify their own preconceptions? This is a process that psychologists call selective reception. Should leaders hire Frank Luntz, or are they contributing to what I would call, as I called earlier, the postmodern dilemma? That is any idea that the listener finds acceptable equal in validity to any other idea at any given time? This is the dilemma of the simulacrum. Right? Is it identical, or is it a reproduced image? And if this is indeed the case, have we moved beyond the conviction that there is a truth, or even multiple truths, or in a very Colbert-esque characterization, are we now only able to deal with the concept of truthiness? Truthiness, according to Stephen Colbert, that great social philosopher of the time, is something that seems like truth that we want to exist. I hasten to point out that there are other methods of communication that all of us would find offensive at one time or another. These forms would have no impact on our understanding of the point at issue and would therefore be counterproductive. But I think this is Frank Luntz's main point. However, when we strive in the first instance to find the most comfortable or comforting language to impart our message, are we literally missing the point? What is the responsibility of the leader in this instance? We hear a lot these days about making the hard choices, facing reality, realizing that we can't have everything. But when a leader couches his message in terms that are more like what people want to hear than what he or she thinks they should know, I'd suggest that he or she is abandoning any claim to be a legitimate leader and has become another public relations expert or advertising salesman. When a speaker relies on what Frank Luntz calls keywords and phrases for the 21st century as a way to mask the impact of the message, this is a step away from legitimate leadership. What are some of those words, by the way? He gives us a list. I mean, it's a very instructive book, and it's almost like a handbook, and it reads very quickly as well. These words are these: accountability. When was the last time you didn't hear somebody talk about accountability? I mean, this is a word that dogs people like me right through the middle of the night. Everybody wants you to be accountable for everything, and you know what that means. That means I want to find a way that I don't get blamed for this. Right? I mean, that's accountability always involves somebody else. Innovation. If you're not innovative, you're dead, right, in today's society. Renew, restore, rebuild, revitalize. I put those together because they are the re-words, suggesting what? Suggesting that we can recapture, he says, continuing the pun, recapture a past that probably never even existed. Right? The good old days, you understand, were never really very good. And people imagine them to be something that they weren't. So restoring those is always a great nostalgic button to push. Efficient. Efficiency is the key to modern existence. Combinations. The one that's more difficult to explain is if you can find a way to say the right to, like you have the right to do something. That's really good, because that seems to show that you have a more sophisticated understanding of what you can get away with. Invest. Invest rather than spend, right, is an important thing. For people like me, again, that's an important thing. When I go to a board meeting, if I can say we need to invest in more faculty, it doesn't sound like we're spending a lot of money to hire people. Right? So it's important. And balance. Balance is important. As you know, Fox News has built a reputation and fairly profitable bottom line on the notion of balance. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter. It's how you receive it. It's how you feel about it when you hear it. So balance is important for you to use. Luntz clearly understands, then, language and its impact. He suggests these words because if harsher or clearer words were used, the message would be lost and communication would fail. I agree completely with his analysis. When the leader uses the wrong vocabulary, excuse me, sorry. When the leader uses the wrong vocabulary, his audience is alienated. One of the most penetrating examples of this is a story about President Bush and Hurricane Katrina. Yeah, I know how many stories there are about that, but this one is particularly striking to me. President Bush was making public statements about the damage done along the Gulf Coast. And in one of those statements, he commented that Senator Trent Lott's house had been destroyed, but that he knew that it would rise again and it would be reconstructed as elegantly and wonderfully as it had existed before, and that he was looking forward to sitting on the front porch with Senator Lott and enjoying the view. This is an example of how personalizing a message makes exactly the wrong impression. It suggested to the listeners that he was more concerned with the senator's vacation home and his own relaxation than he was with the people in the streets who had nothing left and who had actually lost members of their family in the flooding. So in this case, if someone like Luntz had been there, the president might have used words that the people of New Orleans wanted to hear, and the impression would have been one of concern, compassion, and commitment. He missed the opportunity. On the other hand, somebody who would have been able to do that, Luntz, I give you his other side. In January, he circulated a memo to Republican Party leaders entitled The Language of Financial Reform. This wasn't supposed to get out, but the New York Times picked it up, so everybody has had a chance to see it now. In this memo, he suggested that the American public was so outraged by the bank bailouts that any effort to enact banking regulation could be stopped simply by calling it a bank bailout. Opponents of regulation should denounce it as a plot by Washington bureaucrats to take over the banking system. Yesterday, April 13th, Minority Leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, said that the Financial Reform Act suggested by the administration was the biggest bank bailout he had ever seen. So this guy has an impact, and this is the leader of the party in the Congress saying these things. So am I a fan or a critic of people like Frank Luntz? Clearly I'm both. I take him at his word that his concern is effective communication. I admire his effectiveness, and he is really extraordinarily good at what he does. I also believe him when he discusses his belief in the critical nature of language and its functions. I think that if everyone had him at their side when they spoke, the message would be clear, consistent, and comfortable, if not necessarily commendable. The problem is with leaders who use these techniques as a substitute for substance. Some in leadership positions are more interested in the reaction of the audience as a sign of support for their position rather than a commitment to inform the audience so they can make their own judgments. There are also those who say that the audience doesn't want to have the raw material to decide, rather they want to be told what they already believe. This is the misuse of communication theories that we've been discussing. Also makes it impossible for a leader to claim legitimacy as a leader, as I've suggested. That is someone who's trying to put forth a vision supported by methods to achieve that vision. I think this is happening because the purpose of politics has changed. It is no longer viewed as a discussion and debate about problems and potential solutions. The goal now is to vanquish the opposition and impose your truth on the system. Political truth is now contextual and fluid. And this leads directly to the third and last contemporary factor that makes this a watershed era in civic discourse, the supremacy of belief over fact. At the risk of alienating some of you, I would suggest that one example of this is the continuing debate over Darwin's theories of evolution. Leaving aside any consideration of creationism or intelligent design, since there is actually room in here for these positions on a theological and philosophical basis, let's look at the basics of evolutionary theory. Darwin proposed, from a decidedly Enlightenment perspective, that by observing the physical world, collecting empirical physical evidence, that we could then examine how physical reality came to be what it is today. Defenders of this will point to geological evidence of physical transformations of the earth and the ability to identify when certain plants and animals existed. This offers the opportunity for an application of postmodernism to modern science. If one views Darwinism from a post-structuralist perspective that is wholly contextual and not reductionist in its determinism, then it need not apply to today's theories and beliefs. One can assign to his ideas a contemporary agenda which is unconnected to today's reality. This is the danger of interpreting the Constitution from this perspective. We now, in our postmodern world, have the capacity to say that we do not choose to believe this. We have a psychological tendency to adopt ideas that are consistent with our beliefs. Several years ago, more than I care to reveal, I gave a speech entitled "The Pain and Suffering of Education." Not designed to attract people, obviously. The audience was settled before the topic became clear. The thesis of this talk was, I thought at the time, transparent and even maybe too elementary. I suggested that we all had certain preconceptions about the world, derived from our own limited observations or suppositions, and then supplemented by our family's perspectives. Then, as we went through the process of education, we realized that there were alternatives to our conceptions and that some of them actually seemed to make more sense. We thus undergo a very painful process of changing our minds as the result of working our way through numerous methods of discovering what was true. And it is painful to change your mind. Right? Thinking is painful, and it's a difficult thing to do. Most of us don't think for more than half an hour in any given day, do we? I mean, we act according to patterns and habits and routines. If you don't think that's true, just try to remember the last time that you had to go someplace else at the end of your day and you still turned the car toward home rather than to where you were going. We operate by rote most of the time. Well, that clearly, I think, is not so much the case anymore about becoming educated. From religious fundamentalism to political philosophy to the very concept of society, we now see belief trumping what used to be considered fact. So to avoid religion and science, let me go to another topic that's not much less explosive, but one that I like better, right? Economics. Nobel laureate, Princeton economist, and New York Times columnist Paul Krugman wrote about this in a New York Times Magazine article last fall. He suggested that one of the reasons that economists were unprepared for the current crisis is that it didn't fit their models. While they appear to be completely driven by quantification, in reality, all their numerical models are based on an initial assumption about human behavior. The basic premise was that a total acceptance of the unregulated free market to allocate finite resources was what we should pursue. The assumption is that when one individual acts in his own self-interest, it benefits the entire economic process. Coupled with this is the belief that the market will correct excessive action by any individual. But what happens when someone acts in such a way as to manipulate the market with products such as the very complicated derivatives of the last decade? This is a case study in leadership. All the chief financial officers of the United States since the 1980s have been committed to the concept of an unregulated free market. Now, this is not anti-capitalist, so be patient. Alan Greenspan, Robert Rubin, Lawrence Summers, and Timothy Geithner come to mind immediately, names with which you should also be familiar. Mr. Greenspan stated in his recent book, 2007, titled The Age of Turbulence, that his political and economic philosophy were transformed by the work of Ayn Rand. He also admitted that he knew that the Bush tax cuts might be a problem for the national economy, but he supported them because of his belief that the federal government should not have a large amount of money at its disposal because it would spend it unwisely. He also admitted in testimony before Congress in 2008, after the crash, that he was wrong. Recently, he has rewritten history yet a third time with a new book that just came out. So I haven't seen that yet, so I can't comment on it. His testimony regarding this can be found, if you care to watch it, in an episode of the PBS program Frontline. It was originally broadcast October 20th, 2009. It's still available on their website. I would suggest to you that this was a failure of leadership. Leadership was made subservient to philosophy. Greenspan and the others I mentioned are much more famous than I am, but I'd contend that they were offering a program which they presented as scientifically based and empirically proven, but was actually a philosophical position with very little evidence to support it. Even in the Middle Ages, there were rules and regulations to protect participants in the market. Adam Smith himself said that markets could not be trusted without oversight. You know why nobody knows that? Because the invisible hand is in the first 12 pages of that book, and that statement's in the back. And I bet none of you in the room has read all the way to the back of that book, right? Maybe two. The dean. Oh, it's always the dean. That's why he's the dean. It's like Karl Marx's book. Everybody talks about it, but who's read it, and how many are even familiar with all the books of the Bible anymore? It's one of those things that is conveniently forgotten. On this point, a deconstructionist interpretation, I think, is appropriate. It's also an example of belief over evidence. If one listens to Greenspan's testimony, he says this. He says it was his belief that regulation cannot prevent people from making dumb mistakes. It was his belief that an unregulated market was the best mechanism for the creation and distribution of complex financial derivatives. Leadership should have prevented the imposition of beliefs on the economic structure of the nation. Oddly enough, the only aspect of natural law we all seem to accept without question these days is the ostensible law of economics, which is really not a natural law anyhow. Right? It's like statute law. We made it up, and we continue to change it. One of the reasons that we all, or at least some of us, accept this is that we've been told in such positive terms the benefits of economic opportunity and free enterprise, which we all believe, and I do believe that firmly. But we have participated in the triumph of belief over what I've been calling fact, a statement which I myself brought into question earlier this afternoon. Why is this more prevalent than before? Why does it contribute to my contention that this is a watershed of civic discourse? The best answer I've found is in a book by a guy named Farhad Manjoo. Anybody know him? Okay, I can say anything I want then. Farhad Manjoo is a writer for Slate magazine. In his 2008 book, True Enough, Learning to Live in a Post-Fact Society, he suggests that while many people for many centuries preferred their beliefs to other evidentiary-based alternatives, the existence of the internet makes it possible for more people to find supporting statements for their positions than ever before. It's then the instant availability of supporting evidence for any position that we might hold. Also, the repetition is critical. This is why the internet is so central. Consider the concept of the big lie. You've studied that somewhere along the line. That is, if what you say is outrageous enough, and if you say it often enough, and you say it loud enough, someone will eventually believe you. But what if we believe that what we choose, because it feeds our selective reception, because we're simply more comfortable with certain words, because others seem to confirm its validity, what if we believe that that is just as valid as what used to be called fact? We have all heard the expression that everyone has a right to his opinion. But we should remind ourselves that this doesn't mean that every opinion is correct. That's the hardest thing to understand when you're being educated. I fear that we're sliding down that slope into a murky valley where everyone's opinion is correct. We already have a polarized society. This could produce an atomized society. There's a major difference between the bombast and demagoguery of a century ago and the reality of today. The contemporary reality has been affected by the creep of deconstruction theories into public discourse by systematic study and the application of polling and focus groups techniques, the triumph of belief over fact. The dangers are greater because I think the stakes are actually higher. It's important to know if the melting of the ice cap is the result of human behavior or is just another natural cycle. If we know this, then we might be able to select the best method to react to it. If we don't and proceed on belief, then we have at least a 50-50 chance of picking the absolutely wrong way to react. Denial and dismissal of alternative views could lead to disaster. So Mr. Monjou provides the links among our three premises. In a postmodern society, driven by carefully selected words that comfort rather than confront, the internet provides the dynamic element in imposing belief on fact. It's thus the responsibility of leaders in this extraordinarily polarized age to find the language to inform, to encourage, and to inspire. This is the legitimacy of leadership. Otherwise, leaders abdicate their claim to legitimacy and become part of the long list of demagogues that seek to appeal to the base instincts of the audience to achieve some political advantage. Civic discourse is the method of determining who we are, who we would like to be, and where we want to go. Legitimate leaders recognize that. Thank you. Questions?
I think we're absorbing this.
Is the role of the leader then to offer a prophetic voice, something that's kind of critically self-reflective? If they're part of an establishment or part of an orthodoxy at a university or at a hospital or at a business, to kind of critically self-reflect on that and push people into uncomfortable areas?
Yes, except that they don't always have to be uncomfortable areas. But I think the prophetic part of the voice is true, and I think that if you are trying to not necessarily push but encourage an organization or an institution or a group of people to go in a particular direction, then you have to have that sense of clarity about what the institution is and what it should be, such as I said in the last couple of sentences. So yeah, it is the role of a leader to do that, and there has to be, I suppose, in the biblical sense, a feeling of prophecy about it, because in fact what you're doing is trying to figure out what things will be like sometime in the future. And the only way to do that is not to sit down and flip coins. I mean, that's possible, but we all know what the odds are for that. It's to have some sense of analytical capacity to decide what the probability is rather than a 50-50 chance. And if you have the confidence in your own ability and what you've been studying, then it's your responsibility to put that out there and see if people will follow it. So I think yes. Yes?
You were talking about using facts rather than belief to make decisions. And I'm wondering, how would you go about, or how would you recommend people distinguish between the two? Because I think so many people think that their beliefs are facts.
Yeah, I guess I didn't do a very good job in that paragraph. That is the point, and that's the big dilemma today. Right? But why do we think that? We think that, I believe, well, look at it this way. Let's see if I can go back. I think I suggested that throughout history, people have always had alternative convictions, but they didn't have available to them information that would either contradict or confirm those convictions at the same level that we do today. And I think as the 19th and 20th century, after printing certainly, but mostly the 19th and 20th century, with the whole notion in this country of public education came about, access to that was one of the things that contributed to a generally socially accepted definition of facts, which I claim occurred in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, at least up until about 1920 in this country. Why has that changed? Because the availability of what is corroborating evidence for your belief persuades you that if so many other people believe this, then it must be true. And I think that's what's happening with the internet. I just read a review, which I didn't include in this, of a book by James Shapiro, right, who was a Shakespearean scholar. And he wrote this book to try to decide, or to try to make his case for who actually wrote Shakespeare's plays. And he contends that, oddly enough, Shakespeare actually wrote those plays. But he mentions that the other two prominent movements. And this stuck out with me, and I wrote it down, and it's in my handwriting, so I may not even be able to read it. But let me tell you what he says. Those who would deny Shakespeare's authorship, long excluded from publishing their work in academic journals or through university presses, are now taking advantage of the level playing field provided by the web, especially such widely consulted and democratic sites as Wikipedia. So he sees a resurgence in alternative explanations for who wrote Shakespeare's plays, based largely on the availability of other people who have the same doubts, putting it out as fact. I think that's what's happened. Yes?
Is it taking the cultural factors?
That's what taking?
Your idea of what you hear, not what you say.
Yeah. It does. And, you know, that's the biggest shortcoming of what I've said today, because this is a very narrowly focused explanation for this. It's not just Western, right, or European. It's largely American in terms of its interpretation. And I don't have the capacity to really look at how this is going to play out in other places, but I suspect it will be the same. But cultural factors in the United States, I think, come into play in this way. I think it is, in fact, contributing to a resurgence of a class-based perspective in American society that we have thought we were working away from. And I think it's being, and what is class after all, but a recognition of a shared interest or role or function in that society. And the more people that you can find who express that same attitude or function will tend to attract you as part of that group. And I think that could very well spread into a resurgence of class social developments, which I think would be a shame. It's not, so I'm sort of a contrarian on this. I don't believe that it is, in fact, a democratizing instrument the way Wikipedia claims to be. Yeah, please.
I'm interested in the international repercussions of what you're saying, because if we're in a post-postmodern and other cultures, maybe in Islam, are in a very different part of their development, what happens when you have people trying to communicate through translators, trying to come to terms with treaty agreements?
Yeah.
What do words mean? And if we can't even get along within our country,
Right.
how do we get along with people who speak almost a different language when the same words are used?
That's a terrific question. This may be what you were getting at. In fact, I'm sorry I missed the drift of it, but it's clearer now. I apologize for not picking it up. I think what you mentioned is an interesting one. I think what's happened is that we're in this situation with totally different perspectives on truth and belief in a very unusual way. Not many people, I think, would see it this way, and I probably shouldn't even suggest it because I'm thinking about it as I'm going along. But I think that Islamic culture, at one point, the Arabs, the Islamic Arabs in Africa, and certainly in the Near East, were leaders in scientific endeavors in the Middle Ages. Right? They were way ahead of everybody. They preserved a lot of classical society for Europe after they came out of what we call the Dark Ages. What's happened is that I think maybe they had a head start, and they moved beyond that kind of scientific perspective, and because of threats, because of what I think is the context in which they found themselves after the Crusades, I think they've established a greater affinity for belief than for the scientific fact that they had been famous for. And I think, in fact, what we're seeing now, in a peculiar reverse way, is that Islam today is what we could be in another 75 or 80 years. And if we don't figure out how to deal with it now, we're all going to be that way. And then I think we're all going to be back to the point where the mentality of the Crusades will be dominant yet again. Yes?
Well, follow up on Louise's question. This is one about another set of people who speak almost another language, and that is economists. Greenspan, when he testified before Congress, exemplified this with those long
Right.
sentences
Right.
that people tried to parse. In contrast, Adam Smith wrote rhetoric as well as
Right.
Wealth of Nations, and looked to a clearer style of expression as well as of moving with humans,
Right.
goods, and events. My question is whether you think economics can recover from this, and whether the quantification at the root of economics prevents clear communication in the way that you describe.
Yeah, yeah. I as an economics minor, right, I think there is hope for the discipline. Yes, I think they can. I think it is recoverable, but it's going to. It will take something like this particular collapse to push us into that recognition that there has to be a different vocabulary that's used to describe things. In fact, what they've done is persuade us that because they have equations, that it's an irrefutable statement, and we can all make up equations. We do it all the time, and every one of us. They need. I think what we're going to see is there will be a school of people that will finally struggle against the Chicago school, right? Which has dominated the last 40 years of American economics and has given us reliance on the micro side, on the theory of the firm, as the basis of understanding economic behavior. I think that there are people like Paul Krugman, for example, who is not going to be one of the founders of this because he's seen too much as a popularizer, and they're not going to accept that. But he's right on the button on some things. They're going to have to look at human behavior from a different perspective, not in what they think it should be and then build theories on that, but look at the history of it. Look, by my count, the United States has had about 23, now 24 economic recessions or depressions. Some of them have actually been self-inflicted, right? But almost every one of them, except for those 3 or 4, like Jefferson's embargo, right? It's clearly self-inflicted. Roosevelt's recession in 1937 was just a stupid economic decision. But all the rest of them came at the end of a particularly speculative period on whatever the major resource was at the time. In the 19th century, it was land. Then it was oil. And this time it was houses, real estate. And somewhere along the way, being a historian, I think they're going to have to go back and see that there is a consistent pattern in what causes economic systems to come to no good end, rather than saying, this is what we believe, therefore we will construct a system to explain it. So I think there's hope. Yes?
If we are to make some sort of a cultural shift back to a culture of truth as opposed to pretty words and the list that you explained to us, do you think it'll be more likely that it'll come about because leaders will decide that the change needs to come, or because the public will get fed up with what they're being told?
Yeah. You know, when I was your age, that was called the great $64 question. Now $64 is hardly tax on that kind of question. You know, if I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be famous. And I don't. I would like to think that it's going to be a mutual recognition, because leaders are going to come from the population of people that are perceptive about what they have been listening to and what they've been following. And somebody, and I thank you very much, I didn't even remember I said that, the statement that you quoted me on earlier, but I think I believe that. And if you go back and if you think of what Cleve said that I said, those are the people that will emerge out of that group. So I think it's going to be a mutual thing, and I think that there are people out there who are ready to pick up that kind of burden, and it's not going to be single issue anger movements such as we see today. Right? It's going to have to be thoughtful, and that's one of the things that I'm most concerned about, quite frankly, the future of everything, because it's what has made this country different. And from a historical perspective, 500 years down the road, when somebody writes world history and includes us as part of this movement, the way when I started teaching world history, you know, we tried to make sure that we had something from India and something from China so that we could show that we were really being multicultural. One of these days we're going to be in that mix. Somebody's going to look back from some other perspective and say, what made the United States different? Why did it happen there? And I really believe it's going to be two things. This country has been held together by a common acceptance up until now of a fundamental political principle of liberal democracy. And I mean that not in terms of political terms, but liberal meaning liberating from government, from burdens, from outside sources of control, and control of the direction of the society by popular decision, a liberal democracy. And secondly, and Jefferson was absolutely right on this, public education. We have had the best public education system the world has ever seen, and it is now under attack. It's a noble profession, and it should not be criticized at the level that it is. And one of the things that's bothering me the most is that the teachers are getting all of the bad stuff, and they are really struggling to try to do something in this environment. If we don't do something to revive education, then what you're suggesting, what I'm suggesting of changing this culture is probably not going to work. So really, when you get out into the community and you really start to get active wherever you settle for the first time, pay attention to the education system. And that's the highest, beyond voting, that should be your highest sense of civic responsibility.
Thank you very much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Grand Valley State University. Visit us at gvsu.edu.